Thank you. So, yeah, it's my pleasure to be here with you this morning for this event. And I just wanted to start with Black Mountain College because of the obvious connection to the Eden Project in terms of the name and, of course, some of the concerns around collectivity, community, education that you all have been working on for the last decade. Many of you are familiar with Black Mountain, I'm sure, given the region and also the Eden Project's own connections self-consciously made to it. My first book is what you're seeing the cover of, was on a history of Black Mountain College, focusing on models of experimentation at the college. And in that, and I'm not going to go so much into that book, which was published 10 years ago, because just this spring I released a book that in a way was a kind of metabolization, and as Sylvain had intimated, I already said I wasn't I was going to talk about that. So, but I just wanted to kind of motion to this to think of the lineage of Black Mountain College moving into the present, which is what the book that I had just published this year called After Spaceship Earth um, covers. And that book came out of my interest in particular in Buckminster Fuller, who was about a third of the experimenters in terms of the research I did and the writing about his model of experimentation that really focused on futures and thinking about the way in which science and technology and art could create better futures in a sort of almost self-fulfilling way. One could say teleologically, meaning that it's kind of building to a sort of completeness of the future. He had many laudable claims he was making. He taught at Black Mountain College in the late 1940s and erected his first successful geodesic dome there, actually shortly after having erected it at the Pentagon. So this is an interesting paradox around Fuller's patronage. In fact, this is the image of the 1949 geodesic dome assembly at the Lake Eden Black Mountain College campus. But in Fuller's kind of method of trying to join art and design and what he called comprehensive design, he really had a very forward-thinking and progressive vision of feeding, housing, and clothing everyone in the world, given the plenitude of existing technologies. And in that, he was galvanic and mobilizing, particularly college students, beginning at Black Mountain College, which was one of the first places he ever taught, through the 1950s, where he was much more focused in architecture schools, and then to the 1960s, where he really became a kind of techno guru with widely publicized lectures until his death in the early 1980s. He really had a kind of world audience, but really around this idea of thinking about young people's relationship to social change and the way in which technology could be harnessed, using in a way sometimes we can kind of debate the technocratic aspects of Fuller. And in my more recent book, I have some, and I think many artists who, though they're very fond of Fuller, have also suspicions about the kind of technocratic utilitarianism, you could say, meaning that there's a sense that technology can solve everything and then it's rather neutral. We know, or I would argue, that technology is really never neutral and is guided by principles often under the umbrella of whatever social form it arises out of, in our case, capitalism. But Fuller had an optimism, a kind of techno-optimism that I think many people were really interested in. And so this book from the late 1960s, Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, was an interesting one to me, and then it really sort of brought my research on him at Black Mountain College into the Fuller of the 60s, in which he, like many techno-utopians, was really interested in space studying, space exploration, space colonies. Of course, the 1960s globally was the era of space euphoria. But in that, I was also kind of interested in another aspect of the kind of utopianism or dystopianism of the 1960s and 70s, in particular Afrofuturist models that were much more suspicious of the language of colonization for good reasons, thinking about the triangle trade and the slave trade. So a figure like Sun Ra, the musician and impresario, had kind of more of a pessimistic vision of what technology had done and could do. And in a way, was arguing in his cosmology that he had already been to space and that white scientists were in fact, hunting him and his orchestra for these advanced technologies that he already possessed. So kind of flipping the script around technology and access, or a figure like George Clinton of Parliament and Funkadelic, who was arguing in his music and the whole sort of like pageantry of the of this mothership connection. I think the highest grossing tour of its time in the 1973-74 period. Really sort of that like space was already a place that he and his, collective, I mean, thinking about a parliament as a joining of voices, that this, this sort of like positivity crew had already been to space and was sort of bringing the funk to the planet, and sort of the model of the parliament connecting to the brood, or like different ideas of collectivity that are really interesting to explore as a counter model to the somewhat unproblematic acceptance and the Buckminster Fuller logic of a kind of military industrial educational complex that is really, though Fuller argued for this comprehensive design, there was a really a sense of a kind of technocrat that was going to be, attuned to computers and therefore manage everything for the benefit of society, instead of a more perhaps holistic sense of people not having to be masters of technology at all, but just sort of, perhaps in the kind of Afrofuturist sense, you don't have a choice. You're already sort of part of larger processes. In Sun Ra's case, very pessimistic often about what white people had done to Blacks in terms of their technologies. So this book that I just published this year, which is called After Spaceship Earth, is really thinking about Fuller's notion of Spaceship Earth, which I think has two interesting things to consider just about this phrasing. He invented this sort of Spaceship Earth concept. And on one hand, it's like a technological object I find somewhat problematic, as though the Earth is a human created object that we can sort of junk and move on to Spaceship Mars or Spaceship Europa, Spaceship Moon. So there's this aspect of, you could say, the autogenetic fantasy of many technologies, as though they kind of, that humans create worlds and that we can, sort of easily substitute technology for the mystery really of natural ecologies. I mean, we really don't create ourselves. We don't create the ecology. We're sort of not often in a holistic relationship to that in terms of how we maintain those. There's sometimes, the fears of today are really the scorched earth idea of technology, just to extract as much as possible and then move on to the new spaceship. So that's one aspect of the spaceship Earth rhetoric. And then you can also say that, what he was trying to do was to situate humanity in the universe, meaning that, and Fuller would often say, you're already on a spaceship. I mean, the Earth is moving through the universe. It's moving around the sun at a great speed. And so you're already an astronaut. He would say, we are all astronauts. And so, there's this kind of two sides that sort of Janus face. There's the one side of that being kind of an interesting way to elevate one's horizon above the terrestrial, but on the other hand, in a way that sort of necessarily binds the human to the asperity of technologies that really came out of military competition, for example. So, for me, After Spaceship Earth was a way to kind of talk about that, that problem of treating the Earth as a technology, but also the way it does offer a certain vision of our situatedness in the universe, and something to imagine. The heavens have always been a place to imagine something else, and that's a really, it's not something that's unique to Fuller, but it's interesting to imagine how we're doing that today. So this book has, I think there was something like 150 images from at least 50 living artists, over 8 chapters. So I just wanted to give you a sense of a couple of the projects that I talked about that are dovetailing, or at least, or maybe even just more problematically trying to put into the mix this idea of technology, futures, past futures, alternate ecologies, a lot of the the topics of the book, just to try to distill through some of the projects that I write about. So this is a project by Christina de Medel called Afronauts, and she was restaging a real project that happened in Zambia in the early 1960s, in which there was a collective that moved to try to gain money for Zambia to have a space program, and to think about the unequal access to space today, meaning that like now we're in an era of white tech billionaires that have essentially monopolized the formerly civic project of space exploration that we as taxpayers funded its infrastructure, which was then sold off for pretty cheap to figures like Bezos and Musk, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. They own a lot of Cape Canaveral now, which you have to, again, return to the idea like who paid for that infrastructure in the first place. So this is, now we're sort of at a next level where, formerly rich countries monopolized the space program and access to space, and now it's really gone to the level of the kind of oligarch vision of space access. And so this earlier moment of the Afronauts in the 1960s was trying to sort of imagine what would space be truly free? I mean, could it be something that was beyond, sort of rich, like basically first world northern latitude nations access? So in the original project in the 1960s, the Afronauts had basically created a pageantry of space, training. So they, would roll down a hillside in a barrel to simulate zero G, do things with swings, and just a very sort of rudimentary, ways of like manipulating physics in the body without propelling yourself into space using rocket fuel. So in a way, it's like the journey was more important than the destination for these folks. And another artist, also around the same time, who I read about, worked on this project in a film context. So just to see what a flashpoint this Afronauts idea has been to artists, really sort of democratizing, or at least sort of, opening up the possibility of space. And space is kind of almost always an imaginary, outer space is almost always an imaginary place. Very few people have been to outer space. And it's also been very unequal in that access of those few people. I think the last I counted, there was about, I mean, and this is changing all the time because space tourism is multiplying dramatically. But when this book was published, I think about 700 people had been to space, and the proportions of those in terms of race and gender were predictably skewed to white men. So to think about, Black astronauts, female astronauts, and, to sort of universalize space access is something that these artists have been concerned with. Another artist from Syria who is working in Turkey worked on a project called Space Refugee, in which he sort of recovered the history of a Syrian cosmonaut who went to space under Russian training and spent some time on the Mir capsule, and then became an advocate as Syrians were displaced to Turkey for a kind of universalization of space access as a place that might be truly free for those who have no land on Earth. So, the refugee as a figure that's a sort of itinerant and sort of unfortunately ungrounded person, to think of space as a place that would allow for the kind of freedom of and a hopefulness. So a very interesting project trying to imagine, new futures, to kind of invert the sense of, we leave the terrestrial because we have the privilege to do so versus leaving because you don't have any other options. And that's always the stuff of a kind of, utopian, dystopian science fiction, it's like, is space a place of, the kind of like exile, economic exiles, people who are being sort of warehoused. And, I mean, you think of like The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, or Philip K. Dick stories that, that class plays out in space as a place of the unwanted versus other imaginations of space, the ones perhaps being put forward by these white tech billionaires of space as an elite solution to the destruction of the Earth that they themselves are precipitating. So another artist that takes up the final part of this book in the last chapter is an artist named Dawn Dada, who's been very interested in Fuller in her long career. She's, I think, in her mid-70s now, New Orleans based, so I think moving to New York City. And so she worked on projects, various ones related to imagining space, but one that I was particularly interested in was her Space Clown series, where she tries to think of the joining of the sort of the botany of the rich botany of our life with the with really even the kind of uniforms of space. I mean, so often our visual rhetoric of space is very much like silver, like shiny, metallic. And to think of it as something, she talks about these kinds of Baroque patterns as like emblems of the lost plenitude of Earth, as though those who are forced to create new homes in this space after the destruction of the Earth would wear as their kind of badges, that lost bounty of their where they came from. And this came out of a series that she began, a series of photographs that she began during COVID of photographing first responders. She, again, was based in New Orleans and had gone through in a couple years earlier the Ebola outbreak. And so this kind of use of full protective devices, which then during COVID became even more common. So to think of, like, even on Earth, we were creating situations that are inhospitable, dangerous, and that the very breath, that we take for granted, that really is the precondition of all life, terrestrial life, for, advanced life forms, is something that, became, of course, very vulnerable during COVID. I mean, to inspire is to bring the outside in, and respiration is that precondition. So will we be able, to think anew if breath is regulated? The life of the astronaut, one could say, is the most regulated body imaginable. I mean, everything is kind of through ground control, and it's the truly technologically administered body. And is that really what we want in our future? To be completely dependent on technology to do anything, to breathe, to eat, to shit, anything. So this is a kind of like trying to reposition some of the utopianism of technology as this artificial ecology that we will sort of seamlessly move into once this planet, is no longer, is no longer habitable. And to really think about that, these realities of the harshness of space. I mean, there's so many known aspects of that harshness, including the radiation that astronauts suffer without the envelope of the protection of the Earth's atmosphere, loss of bone density, and so on. So to sort of like try to reinsert our nature into this future, which is not really the nature of our species. This is another artist based in Toronto that was working on, she's a Ethiopian Muslim artist, and sort of reimagining space through the eyes of women, in particular, and children, and how infrequently, space travelers are imagined to be women. There's also another piece, I don't think I have an image of it, by Skawineti, who's a Mohawk artist. She Falls for Ages, where she imagines a Hodinese Mohawk story of Sky Woman as an astronaut. So, the first land is really the result of her having come from Sky World to create this new space. So in a sense, an autogenetic fantasy, but working with the animals of the planet to create the first land, with the turtles and the beavers helping her with her seeds that she had brought from Sky World. So trying to think about other, vectors of futures that, are not so much the familiar stories, I guess, of the right stuff, that sort of military history of jet fighters competitively trying to master space, and to kind of undo that rhetoric of mastery. And this is the final project I'll talk about, actually maybe the second to last, which is Connie Samaras' photography of the building of Spaceport America, which is boondoggle in the New Mexico desert. Finally, I think it's being used. I mean, it's leased, I think, by SpaceX, which is Elon Musk Corporation, for a pittance. I think Richard Branson, the Virgin Galactic, was, the one sort of like pushing this, but it was really funded by taxpayers, but it's really not space of the public. When you think of the airport as a kind of strange half space between spaces, but spaceport, any kind of spaceport vision is really going to be an elite, an elite concept. I mean, these space tourism flights begin at $200,000, $250,000 per trip. And, it's quite destructive to the environment given current technologies to be using, rocket fuel to propel, vehicles out of space just for the sake of tourism. And so this project, designed by Norman Foster, who was a great fan of Fuller's and sort of semi-associate in the early 1970s, is kind of one of the problems, I guess, of contemporary architecture and its patronage structure, is that it's, sort of like seems to be something that's like a public benefit, but really has very little public benefit. I just wanted to show you this because this was really the origins of this book. Was I read in the New York Times in 2015 about Jeff Bezos having a press conference at Cape Canaveral when he bought certain launch pads, and it took me forever to actually track down the video of the press conference of which this image comes from, and just the kind of funny way in which Bezos is proposing that he's at some point in the future going to have a press conference for all of you in space. He was addressing the crowd, of which there's only white men visible on stage, and who knows who the press corps is for this particular event. But I felt so uninvited to this, this sense of like the press conference in space as a member of the press myself at moments, as an art critic, just this image of Bezos with his big phallic rocket. And it didn't seem all that different than the way that space had been imagined in the past, previously, as sort of like a kind of fearful space of like powerful people doing bad things, in the name of the public. And just the final works I'll talk about are by Trevor Paglen, an artist who's been very concerned with the hidden in space and the sort of beauties of imagining technology of the heavens outside of the way it's currently being understood through surveillance primarily, and also governmental and corporate surveillance, and also the competitive schemes of various kind of space mining, space tourism, and space colonization ideas. This is a piece that is very hard to read visually. It's there's four little dots in this image, and those are geostationary satellites that are not moving as the night sky as the Earth turns, because they're positioned with the Earth. And so those are of unknown origin. No one, claims this. And Paglen at the time was really interested in black ops and different ways in which the military was hiding the things that it was doing, the US military in particular. But these things still happen in real spaces. These planes for extraordinary renditions still land in certain places that they're not registered. So this vision he was making of space and trying to understand the hidden, of what's already out there. And he's also really interested in space junk and just the way in which there's just so much happening in the near heavens that can be considered quite pernicious in terms of governmental and corporate surveillance. And to imagine, instead of this kind of vision of space, which was another thing that triggered this project, was imagining, this kind of like white billionaires and their guests, sort of taking up like space in space. But to think about what as Paglen has been doing, is like, what would it be like to aestheticize space in a way that doesn't have to do with capitalism, doesn't have to do, with in a way like a continuation of some of the logic of exploitation and inequality that we face on Earth. So these non-functional satellites that he was working on and continuing to work on, up through COVID, he was supposed to launch one, but his launch date was canceled because of COVID. to do something in space, to make space visible. These were intended to be as bright as possible as they existed and to be temporary and self-destruct, and in self-destruction become even more visible. So to create some relationship of the human to space that's about art. I mean, I have personally seen Elon, the SpaceX rockets tearing through the air when I was in the Caribbean earlier this year. And it's sort of shocking and strange that these things are being blown up, and you don't really have any stake in it, like as a citizen, right? It's just stuff. It's like, it is kind of the stuff of dystopian nightmares. There's just going to be transports going and, you're not part of that, like, and that it does remind me of some of Philip K. Dick's more dark visions of people fleeing Earth. But for Paglin, he wanted, I think, in these pieces to make, to make space beautiful, and to allow us to have an aestheticization of this in the best sense. And there was, controversy around this project. People are like, oh, it's going to be too lighting up the night sky too much. And, I think for his, on his, definition of what this project was, or his exploration of it, was to really, make give better attention to something that we have sort of not imagined as a literal space of technology. We don't think about the satellites. We don't think about what's going on, around us already, but to really mark that as a space that, we should attend to, we should be concerned with. So I think that's all that I have, and we're right, I'm a few minutes late, so sorry, but I think there's some time for questions if folks are interested.
Thank you very much, Eva. I have a first question myself, if it's all right. Um, you show us a certain vision of space as a space of exploration and also to exploit the resources and maybe find another Earth, even for the humanity to set in. And on the other side, you have a literary poetry art practice of decolonize practice made by minorities that is based on a certain speculative fiction to um, also imagine a new space, but also a new Earth. So it's like a very balanced, like exploration on one side and exploring social contradiction and forces and of struggle fights of minorities. Maybe you can develop a little this private, I mean, these forces that goes all together.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. And I think it is part of what I'm calling this kind of pageantry of space, without really being a space that many people intend on physically visiting, but that it's been such a historically important space, particularly how it links up to the future, and the kind of the sense that you have a way of mobilizing, people like into a better future. And so some of these artist projects like do involve a kind of almost like play acting, to do something that like is a storyboarding a better future, not in any way really thinking like, no, we are going to space, but how important it is to claim that space as one that you have a stake in. And that's, I mean, when in the case of someone like Sun Ra, I think legitimately he thought that he was from Saturn, or that it was very important that that be, like a kind of like the story was supposed to be more real than like, okay, we know this is fake, and for him that, again, the cosmology of the orchestra was really about being in an advanced interplanetary technology, the orchestra, and that this is something that, he could offer to African Americans on Earth as an escape from white racism. And it sort of had to be like almost true, like you had to put the costumes on, like every night to like enact this fantasy. But I think for many it's important, whether or not you have a deep belief structure about, like one's relationship to space, to really commit to it as a place that you're not going to allow to be, like only, I don't know, I think there's something really powerful about having a holistic vision of stewardship of the earth as a kind of, terrestrial, our terrestrial home. But I think for many, there's also something really important about thinking the terrestrial and in a dialectical way to the universal, you know, like there is no terrestrial without the universal. So we can sit here and be like, you know, I mean, at the end of my book, I kind of go to this idea of mothership Earth through the mothership connection of George Clinton and through Don Dede's work to think about that holistic, that dynamic of a holistic vision of stewardship of the Earth. But I still feel like it would be irresponsible in a way to not think of our atmosphere as having something outside of it, though we don't on a day-to-day basis access. It's sort of like topology, right? Like we live in a Euclidean geometry most of the time, but it's not, you know, it would be irresponsible to say, okay, there's no possibility of extra dimensionality. And I think for them, it's like, you know, they're interested topographically, like, yes, this is our Earth, but like there is this other, there are these other spaces that we are in relationship to, even so much as it's our origin, you know, like that this matter came from somewhere that isn't native to this planet. Then that's the Big Bang, you know, it's like something that like connects us to the universe or whatever forms of like, you know, like universalism you can imagine. So I think that's where there's a kind of push and pull between, like I said, a you know, pragmatic relationship to like being good to the earth and like pushing that, but also to be fantastical in one's imagination of our both origins and like maybe futures, you know, not given, you know, contemporary technologies, which are very fossil fuel heavy. And there's other artists I write about, like Tomas Saraceno, who has been really concerned with trying to universalize space access outside of fossil fuel consumption, which I think is a really important counter model to like what has been such an unproblematic way for so many to imagine, okay, well, we have to get to space over and over again, and it's just ruining the atmosphere to do that, you know, and also just as petroleum based.
Yeah, well, actually, it leads me to another question, very quick. Afrofuturism has been extremely influential for many artists over the last 50 years, at least, and in terms of philosophy, practice, representation, and also approaching, you know, social issues and a solution like ecofeminism, xenofeminism, and other, you know, ecological, feminist, social practice, whatever. Um, it's been very influential also for white male like me, because as a reader, as a theoretician, and also as a practicer, I've been clearly influenced by Afrofuturism, and also one of, you know, writers and you know, theory writers. Um, how do you see that, you know, in the field of contemporary art, you know, today, also as a professor, because you also teach at Pratt Institute?
Yeah, I mean, it's a completely great point because I came to some of, I mean, I've always been a fan of science fiction and figures like, you know, Octavia Butler and more recently N.K. Jemisin, love that stuff so much. But really, someone like Frederick Jameson trying to talk about the importance of science fiction in literature and also as a kind of ideological model of like alternate futures has been very important. And, you know, he's a white dude, or he was a white dude. So it's obviously this interconnectedness of like understanding the struggle, you know, to really think futures instead of, I think what for Jameson he cautioned is that it's not so much about utopianism and dystopianism, but it's really about maintaining the space for speculation as opposed to what he called anti-utopianism, which is very familiar to us in terms of the kind of status quo-ism of capitalism, you know, defining itself as sort of like a outside of the future, like it is eternal and complete, you know, like there's no outside of capitalism. And so for Jameson, he wants to, you know, understand that tendency to foreclose the creative possibility of reimagining the future as, you know, he defines it as a kind of anti-utopianism, and really the struggle is to open up those spaces, whether you want to, you know, it's not of such great interest to him to define them as utopian or anti or dystopian, you know, because one person's utopia is another person's dystopia, or that it's just so hard to imagine as a writer, for example, or as a artist, like what futures are because these are all collective projects. There is really no potential to really revolutionize anything without social struggle. So that's something I think for Jameson also that he understands. Anti-utopianism is something that really wants to individuate and, you know, create a kind of anomie, you know, that loses like the sort of histories that are already there about imagining better futures, you know, whether that's, you know, this sort of long history of revolutionary struggle which always had like something fantastic. I mean, I think of the French Revolution, where it's like the end of money, like the end of slavery, like those were radical propositions in their time, the end of time, right? Like all of the third war, like these like so that was all like you could say that that was a revolutionary, potential link to radical futures. So yeah, I think in that sense it's not so much like what race you are, but to sort of link it up to like the sort of like shared project of trying to, just eliminate injustice.
Dylan, I've got,
There's a question.
yeah, I have like several
Yeah.
or.
Julie, you want to come here for the mic? Okay.
Hi, Eva. I'm Julie Talbert. I'm the Executive Director of the Fine Arts Festival Association here in Rockingham County. We are the program partner for the Eden Summer Institute. This has been fascinating to me. As you can see, I'm the oldest person in the room. And in my formative years, um, the I watched the moon landing as a child. And it really did inform our lives. And it was a huge part of my upbringing. And as a bit of an extension, I am also a great fan of funk music. Um, I saw I saw Parliament Funkadelic in 2018, lost part of my hearing. George Clinton was still amazing, but I have always been a P-Funk fan. Um, so the sort of dovetailing these, as the oldest person in the room, I'm wondering, your presentation was fascinating to me and frightening, and of course, brought back some memories. But I'm wondering, as my generation dies, and I think that's the only thing that's going to save the earth, quite frankly, um, because we have idolized going to the moon, space, what space can do, and therefore, when people start asking critical questions about why are we doing this, why do we have a stupid ass space force, why are these things happening, not from a standpoint of what is it doing to the earth and space, but that sense of wonder and exploration, is that going to be where a shift happens? And I'm also curious about, um, this space and music together, because as you know, in the mid seven or early to mid 70s, or even in the late 60s, as we were going to the moon and going back to the moon many times, this becomes a huge theme in the music that I grew up with as a teenager and young adult. And it wasn't just Parliament Funkadelic. The Mothership Connection, of course, was George Clinton's shtick. But it was all over the place. So those are two themes that go.
Well, it's interesting that your formative space moment was moon landing and mine was the Challenger accident. Because
I was there
well,
for
they wheeled
that.
out the TV for that one, and it was like, oh, maybe we shouldn't have watched that one live. So there was a kind of bookending of like the space optimism, and of course the space program in the 60s, well, profiled how many failures, and loss of life were part of that. But there's interesting that I think much more of like a real formative ending was the end of, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the sort of closure of both the Russian and the United States, the shuttering of those programs as sort of like real, sort of real civic projects. And that's where that in that gap is where these tech billionaires now have sort of swooped in to claim that infrastructure. And that's the really problematic aspect to me, because of course the space programs came out of a military logic of space races and conquest and competition, but they were still sort of ultimately like related to taxpayers. And like NASA was, didn't just give us like dried ice cream. Like there was some sense like it was doing something for, and that had just a lot to do with jingoism and national identity in somewhat problematic ways. But now I think we've entered a new phase that I think is really you know, why I think a lot of artists now are returning to space as something to reclaim because it's in such a like dark moment around white tech billionaires, you know, which themselves, like, why are they billionaires? You know, that has so much to do with a notion of technology as a space of speculative capital, right? That they basically created technologies we don't really need in a totally under-regulated, under-taxed way. Made a lot of money,
Well,
and we don't
uh,
have, like, we should be like we should have some of that money because it's like
consider this too, as as there, as our nation browns, and as the population browns, you're seeing this huge backlash and this need for white people to hang on to power. And this is the struggle. And I think space is just part of it. Because we're gonna struggle for everything.
Mhm.
And right now we're either in the peak. I'm waiting for the tip. I'm waiting for the tipping point. And if I don't know whether I don't know whether we're going to survive to the tipping point. So
It's
I don't
like a
know.
way to be optimistic about, like, not so much that we can sidestep the logic of competition, because that has been so ingrained in our way of imagining the future, you know, is that like you have to, and that is, I think, part of this way that capitalism, you know, sort of positions itself as a totality, that we have to be competitive in order to even survive at all. And that there's disposable populations that are already sort of understood in capitalism as to not be part of that survival. And that's just a perversion, you know, of what we can be doing as, you know, as a kind of planetary holistic, you know, stewardship, right? Is that we don't have to have that. And I think that the Fuller came out of a post-scarcity um moment in the 1960s. It was really about, like, we have all of these amazing technologies, we have all this, you know, like there was a kind of limitlessness of like oil forever, you know, and that post-scarcity was understood so recently after the publication of some of his 60s books, like with the oil crisis in 73, to not be, you know, so much about planetary, but still we can maybe sort of tease out some of that hopefulness about feeding, housing, and clothing everyone in the world, and that redistribution would be a way to think about the future as opposed to competition, which I think has been so, you know, ingrained, as though there's this precarity that we've internalized as like a necessity of the future. And it's completely an imposition of capitalism's logic of creating disposable population. So in that sense, I think maybe if we just, you know, don't emphasize the competitive like end times thing. It's like, oh, we're all gonna be like trying to get on the golden parachute, you know, to get off the planet when it's gonna be scorched earth. To think like, well, you know, maybe someone like Donna Haraway would be a good insertion into this, where in her most recent book, like Staying with the Trouble, is like, yes, things are bad, but like don't just, that's not, we don't have to engineer and like imagine these masculinist visions of competition as our only solution. We might be here with the cockroaches and the pigeons, but let's all get along.
Yep.